Hi, it's Somya, and today we will be covering data types in Python. So in Python, many different things can be stored as data, but the most essential of these things are known as primitive data types. And inside primitive data types, we have stuff like numbers, strings, or which are like words and sentences and stuff like that. And we have Boolean variables, and we'll get a lot more into the specifics of those things later on. So first of all, what are data types? So, like mentioned before, Python gives you a way of storing many different things as a form of data. And data type represent the classification of these data items. So if you store a certain thing in a certain variable, that specific thing is classified as a certain data type. And there are four primitive data types, which are the most important, or not important, the most widely used of all these data types and the most necessary. And these four are strings, integers, floats, and Boolean variables. So first onto strings. Strings are data types that store a string of characters, and a string is always enclosed in quotation marks. So by a string of characters, I mean so if you look at what a character is on your, just like normally what a character is in the English language, you see that it's kind of like one singular element, not necessarily a letter. Like it can be a space, it can be an apostrophe, it can also be a letter, it can be a number, any of those things. So that's a character. And if you enclose a bunch of characters inside quotation marks, that in Python and many other different languages is known as a string. So an example of a string is this one here, which says hello world, and that's a very staple kind of convention of an example of a string. So in this string, we can see that this is a string of characters. To be exact, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 characters in this string. So this would be a string as it is a string of a bunch of characters, and you see that it's enclosed in quotation marks. And this next example here, although this could be a number, 1234, you see that it is enclosed in quotation marks, which makes it a string instead of a number. We'll get more into how to identify and classify integers and other types of numbers in Python, but if anything is enclosed in a quotation mark, in quotation marks, it's always a string. And the last two, true and false, are technically Boolean variables. Again, we'll get into that a little bit later, but these are enclosed in quotation marks, so we can know that it is a string. Okay, so next up is integers. An integer is a data type that stores integers. So an integer, if you're not already familiar with that, is essentially a number that's either negative, 0, and positive, and it can't be like a decimal or anything. It has to be a whole number. So that's essentially what an integer is, and integers in Python are the exact same thing as in math. So an example of an integer could be negative 20, 10, 0, or this number here. But if I put quotation marks around this would no longer be an integer. This would be considered a string. So it's important to understand the difference between the two, even though that something could be interpreted as a number or an integer. If it is inside quotation marks, it is always going to be a string. Alright, so next up are floats. So a float is essentially a fancy term for a decimal number. It essentially means the same thing as a decimal number. For example, we have 1.0, 2.45, -6.7896, 5.5555, and 3.14. So remember, anything with a decimal point cannot be an integer. If there is a decimal or anything with a decimal point, that must be a float because it simply just does not fall into the category of integer. And again, if I were to put quotation marks around one of these, this would be then considered as a string. Alright, the final one is a Boolean. A Boolean is a data type that stores a binary value, which is either true or false. So if you're not familiar with the term binary essentially means like one or the other, 0, 1, off or on, there's two options and it can either be one of two things. So there are two values for a Boolean, for a piece of data that is a Boolean, and this is true or false. You can think of true as being on and false as being off. So Boolean variables are actually really important. Boolean data types are very important in kind of most of the stuff you'll see later in coding with logical expressions and loops and stuff like that. So it's important to keep this in mind. This will be visited a lot later. So that's it for data types in Python. So obviously these are not the only data types you'll see. These are just the primitive ones, the most widely used and the most necessary for programming.